As you can see from the slide, I'm currently a professor at I got to get used to this. It was Ryerson University, Toronto Metropolitan University. But more importantly, I'm a faculty member in the Entrepreneurship and Strategy Department at the Ted Rogers School of Management. I'm also cross-appointed to our Environmental Applied Science and Management program, which gives me an interesting relationship with some of my environmental scientists. I like to refer to myself as a pragmatic environmentalist. But the work that we're doing at the Clean Energy Zone, which is part of our university's Center for Urban Energy, has been dealing with various startups working in the hydrogen space and in the CO2 extraction space. And so today what I want to do is I want to update everyone in terms of what I would say has become a bit of a celebrity thing, which is hydrogen. And to talk about how hydrogen and the hydrogen economy works with our local industry as it pertains to carbon sequestration. So I think what's important for us to understand is why do we need to consider even going that direction? This gives you an idea here in terms of emissions in Canada. You can see that as a country, we're doing pretty well. You know, we have stabilized in terms of CO2 emissions. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. You do have to ignore this data point right here. That's COVID. Okay, I'm not expecting us to stay down there for the next year of data. So again, in terms of per capita emissions in Canada, which I think is a more important metric, you can start to see that we're, again, ignoring this data point here. You know, this is overall sort of greenhouse gas emissions. These are CO2 emissions here. We've had really over the last 10 years a slow decline on a per capita basis in terms of emissions. So the question has to be, you know, how serious do we want to be about moving forward when we have to consider not only the environmental impact, but we also have to consider the economic and social impact of trying to clean up our environment. As I said, I'm a pragmatic environmentalist. So this is Ontario, okay? So in Ontario itself, you can see 2005, the various emissions in terms of sectors. 2018, who can tell me what the big difference is? Why are we seeing this drop from 203 to 165? Coal, the cancellation when we stopped producing power from coal. And you can see that in terms of the electricity number here, you see, and here. But what we have to show and talk about is that we do have sectors where we're seeing growth in terms of emissions. And that's the transportation sector here and our building sector. In other words, heating going forward. So in terms of the building sector, you can see this. So, you know, I showed you the overall emissions, but in terms of the building sector, we're seeing this again, weather-dependent numbers, obviously, but we can see this slow, steady rise in terms of emissions. When we look at the transportation sector, we can see that, again, ignoring COVID here, we can see again, you know, this steady rise. So this is where we have two sectors that we really need to consider in terms of how do we stop emissions, how do we clean things up. Well, maybe it's the hydrogen economy, but what does it look like? And the hydrogen economy, and this is a wonderful graphics from the Department of Energy in the United States. And what I want to focus on here, because this is quite a diagram, is I'm going to focus on, there's the transportation in terms of how it links to a hydrogen economy. I want to also show the whole notion of heat and distributed power. And then what about the fossil fuel industry and carbon capture? And as you can see from this diagram, we can see that we have currently this and this is the American example, but in Canada, you know, similar. We have a very established natural gas infrastructure in North America. And there is a way in which we could look at a business model that would help us in terms of dealing with emissions associated with heating, emissions associated with transportation, around the production of hydrogen and the use of carbon sequestration going forward. So what this is here, and this is provided courtesy of S&P, Standard & Poor's Financial Services, it gives you a wonderful indication from a forecast perspective and relatively recent around costing associated with hydrogen production. And what you can see is this is nirvana right here, okay? The whole idea of producing hydrogen from the use of renewables as the energy source and allowing us to extract or to produce hydrogen. It's not competitive yet. The forecast is that we're going to slowly start to see, now again, it's a range depending on the processes and the locations and so on, but we're starting to see the possibility that we'll get renewable hydrogen down at levels that are consistent with more established technologies today in terms of things like steam reformation and then steam reformation and the possibility of using carbon capture for hydrogen produced from fossil fuels. This is just another graphic here to give you an idea. I think what I want to really point out here is that you understand that by 2030, we're still going to see a significant cost difference associated with hydrogen production. And that'll all come into play in terms of how forward we move with this particular technology and the use of hydrogen going forward. So for many of you in the room, this is a relatively simplistic diagram, but what I want to use it for is to point out the importance of recognizing that innovation is a transitionary thing. I was explaining at lunch today, I work with a number of environmental scientists from the other program I'm cross-appointed to. So these are biologists and chemists, and they want to see change very quickly. And I think they need to recognize my role at the center, and my role in that program is to instruct on commercialization of innovation, and that's really my research area. So when we talk about the economic transition, therefore, to get us to a hydrogen economy and a perfectly clean hydrogen economy, is going to be one that involves the use of existing oil and gas reservoirs. There is a tremendous amount of research out of the United States that points to the importance of using enhanced oil recovery technology and CO2 use as part of that in allowing us the ability to economically move forward to develop carbon sequestration that is essentially economically supported purely by the sequestration going forward. So that's the low-hanging fruit, as we say. Then we start looking at deep saline aquifers. So what the research out of the States is saying is that we currently economically do it. I mean, the biggest problem is finding the CO2. We do that now as part of enhanced oil recovery. Once the infrastructure and the scale builds on that, then you could use the same equipment, the same facilities, the same leases to start thinking about the deep saline aquifers for carbon sequestration. And then ultimately the idea of salt caverns as well going forward. So that is what the research is saying in terms of an economic transition going forward. I put this very quickly together, and I'll apologize if I'm a little inaccurate with it, but it is a comparison of if we were to take 1 kilo of hydrogen and use that high value of $2.16 a kilo, and I used equivalents in terms of other fuels, we still see that natural gas remains very, very cost competitive, whereas we're seeing the current prices of crude and therefore gasoline are starting to reach levels whereby hydrogen will make sense as a replacement fuel going forward. It still needs to be piloted in many cases, but we're now starting to see the economic side of things pointing this out. So in summary, what I want to say is I think we're still going to see natural gas is very, very important in the transition process. And I get a little nervous when we see, well, we're off coal now. Now it's time to get off natural gas. I think that's a big mistake. The blue hydrogen idea is going to be a contributor to scaling going forward for green hydrogen. An old client used to say this: the solution to pollution is dilution. He said it in a negative context as far as I was concerned, but from a more positive context, I think the idea, and I don't know if Enbridge is here. Is there anyone from Enbridge here? Okay. That whole idea of diluting natural gas. Now, if you think we could take it up to 20% of the volume, then you're looking at 20% of the reduction in emissions. Okay? But again, there are facilities issues, so on and so forth. But if carbon pricing continues to grow in this country, the idea of diluting natural gas with hydrogen is going to have more merit. And then finally, transportation, in terms of the use of electric vehicles, will remain the dominant light transport innovation technology going forward. We're still going to have to produce the power for that, of course. But heavier transportation may start looking at hydrogen in a greater light, particularly now that we're seeing higher petrol prices going forward. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone, and I'm available in person for questions and answers.